The Hyperion Cantos was not about the planet, but about the passing of the self-styled titans called humans. It was about the unthinking hubris of a race which dared to murder its homeworld through sheer carelessness and then carried that dangerous arrogance to the stars, only to meet the wrath of a god which humanity had helped to sire.
And welcome back to the Reign of Books podcast, the reader's entry into great narratives where the written page reigns supreme. I'm John Keel, joining you from the War Room. My co-host is Josh Preston, joining you from the Hyrule Cube. We are reading the book Hyperion. This is episode 8 and part 2 of our 3-part podcast series on Hyperion. The book is absolutely epic. It's getting deep. There's a lot to discuss, and we're going to go ahead and jump into the news. Josh, take it away.
Hey John, first up on the news in the publishing industry, we have a new agreement with the New York Public Library, which the library is still alive and kicking. They've entered the digital age, but basically there's not a lot of vendors out there who do ebooks good with libraries. So this story is about Bookish. Bookish is a search recommendation engine that has been acquired by the New York Public Library. So basically, just like Netflix and Amazon, you should be getting better recommendations from your public library in order to utilize their ebook collection. So for me, this is exciting because Overdrive was the vendor that has a lot of libraries on board, and when I go to my own public library, it's hard to actually get ebooks because they don't have that nice. They have nice thumbnails on the screen, but I can't sit here and search for anything that I want without very strict limitations. So a public search engine recommendation for books can only be a good thing. So I'm going to maybe start renting or checking out ebooks more.
Moving on to the next story. This is coming from the New York Times. Basically, it's about web fiction and serialized fiction on a social media platform, and this has kind of been a theme that we've talked about in the last 7 podcasts. This continues to come up, but this article specifically was about the app Wattpad and the great success that authors or writers are having putting their works out on Wattpad in chunks. So different from the Twitter story we talked about last time, where you're only putting out 140 characters and these little chunks of your story. You can put a whole chapter on Wattpad, and the article discussed maybe you put 2,000 words on there. That equals about 10 minutes of reading for the average reader. And authors are finding they're getting a lot of feedback on Wattpad, more so than on a lot of other platforms. So one author was cited as putting up her work, and then within a matter of a day or two, she ends up with 10,000 comments on the work, which is huge. Now the thing with Wattpad is you're not really there to monetize it by putting it on Wattpad. So it's not like you're self-publishing on ebook with Kindle, but you could get some of these readers to sponsor you as a writer, and so this seems to be taking off. There's a couple things in the article that I don't agree with, like some people are lamenting the death of the novel because of things like Wattpad. I couldn't disagree with that more. I'm not going to be interested in owning little bits and pieces of a book. I would pay money for a full-blown novel that I can sit down and read. So I kind of disagree with the direction the article was going, but I think it's cool. That's another platform for writers to use with a lot more feedback.
It has 2 million writers and 100,000 pieces of material a day. You're right, they don't get paid. It's a social network. So I think if writers can sit here and, just like a social network, add, delete their content and create a fan base, that's another way to go. And that's a continuing trend in the self-publishing industry. The third story, John, is the book spotting app. Instead of train spotting, you have book spotting. And it's a Scottish-based app where you can go to Scotland, and while you're there, you can sit here and find books and the scenes and locations from that book in areas you're at. It doesn't need a data connection. You can sit here and download several thousand books, I believe, and the app contains recommendations for literary tours, guiding users through adventures of characters. Basically, if you want to see where Braveheart happened, you can sit here and go through the Scottish countryside on your next trip that you plan there. But actually, I see this value in this type of app because I went to Paris in one trip that I take every year, my annual trip, and I was actually reading The Count of Monte Cristo. And when I was there, that's when the Count, the famous Edmond Dantes, actually enters Paris in the book. So for me, it was really fun to go on Google Maps and I try to actually find the main strip in Paris where Edmond Dantes might have visited. So I think I got pretty close, but this app would have been advantageous, and I could have hit the mark exactly and say I visited one of the most important locations in all of literary history. So, John, any books that you would, any countries you'd want to visit with the app where you could visit the locations?
I think I would like to visit. Well, I've been to Germany already. No, I'm good. I saw a lot of stuff there.
And that is the news, ladies and gentlemen. John, we are entering part 2 of Leviathan. Excuse me, Leviathan. Forget that. We finished Leviathan. We're in Hyperion.
Hyperion! How dare you?
We are in Hyperion. And Hyperion is completely different. It's a hardcore science fiction novel. The middle of this book, which we're currently in right now, John, it matches and I think surpasses the beginning of the book. It raises the bar significantly. Dan Simmons plays with your expectations because you have a pilgrimage to a planet where basically on the verge of war and where basically the future of humanity might be decided. And you have 7 people actually going there, and each of them has their own mysterious reason for going. And there are some jaw-dropping revelations, jaw-dropping. And basically, the expectations just get flipped upside down in this section. In the first part, it's like a mystery wrapped in layers of mystery, and it's all tied together because of this common pilgrimage and the connection with a very evil and omnipotent being called the Shrike on the planet. So if you're joining us for the first time, that's kind of the basic context about why would these people in their right minds be going to actually see this thing when essentially it might be the end of their lives, but each of them have very compelling reasons for this. And John, we get into the third character's motivations for coming to this planet. And I cannot tell you, I was floored with the revelations of Martin Salinas. He's our, what did you call him earlier? He's the poet, but
he is the poetic relief because he's constantly making sarcastic poetic statements at everybody in the group, and I keep laughing at him. So he's my poetic relief for this story.
Yeah, he's the, I guess because he is pretty funny with how candid he is. He's the poetic and comic relief. He's like killing 2 birds with 1 stone. But Martin Salinas is not a, I guess, sympathetic character. So, you know, with the description of our ensemble cast here, you pretty much don't think he's going to be a big contribution or be the hero of the book. But his story is absolutely fascinating, and the reason I think it's fascinating for a number of reasons, but we find out the big bombshell that's dropped right out the gate is that he is from Old Earth. Old Earth was destroyed 5 centuries ago, John, and so no one could survive for 5 centuries except in cryogenic sleep, which is part of how they travel through outer space. But even then, you would pretty much go insane, or there's a high likelihood, I think 1 in 6 chances of having a stroke. And not to mention the equipment on the ship failing as it's traveling through space for 100 years. So bottom line is, his story starts with his former life 500 years ago, and I was absolutely stunned that this was, his story, but also the fact it told about how Earth did die. So what did you think about? You said this meant a lot to you. We talked just briefly about the fact that, as a writer, and kind of you have the same interest, that the way this whole section was characterized was deeply impactful, and I want to hear about what your thoughts as a writer were.
Yeah, so the whole, and we haven't gotten to Silenus' entire story yet, which we will, but his story in its entirety was, it got me a little emotionally invested in this particular character and some of the other characters around him, because I thought the ending of Silenus' story was tragic. But something I picked up right away on is that Dan Simmons, I guess at this point in the book, I realized that, and to use a cliche phrase, this story is by writers for writers. Okay, because Dan Simmons, isn't it interesting? He's focusing in on a character who is a writer and a poet. Why would that really matter in a science fiction story typically? But you find later on, I think writing or stories rather, they may matter to the Shrike a little bit too. But so Silenus is a writer, and then when you track Silenus' story, it's his foray into writing. His whole story is about his writing and what that meant. And there's a lot of funny stuff we're going to get to, but starting off, you talked about cryogenic sleep. When he did leave Old Earth, and when he did get a little bit of brain damage in cryogenic sleep, and his story explores how he had to get his vocabulary back, and how important that was. But anyway, I don't want to get too far ahead. But yeah, by writers for writers, Dan Simmons really thinks a lot of writing, and it was really refreshing to me to see such a unique science fiction character. Writing is still alive and well 700 years from now.
And you know what? He makes that readily apparent. This whole section of the book is hilarious because it covers a lot of cliches. It's a lot of commentary on the writing profession today. So Dan Simmons is kind of tongue-in-cheek with a lot of things that are good and bad about the writing industry, which is hilarious. But for people who are reading the book, this is kind of a section where it's a lot of explicit things because of how he talks and basically how his lifestyle. So Silenus on Dying Earth, in the beginning quote from the podcast, was a very powerful observation and a kind of the thesis of his life's work, which is we're a dying race. Our hubris destroyed our planet. We took it out to the stars, and now we have the wrath of a god is after us, and we helped create this thing, the Shrike that they're talking about. So the whole motifs of religion do play heavily, but this book is not some lightning rod book about theology, but it's incredible how they intermix it into this larger intergalactic mystery. So the dying Earth, Silenus talked about, it was his playground, and I loved the whole description. And the long story short is, earthquakes. A black hole, I think, got into the center of the Earth. So how do we destroy Earth? It's a black hole, and it's in the center of the core of the Earth. They didn't go into any great detail, but it was funny that only the rich old families stayed behind. And then during the horrible seismic activity that, pretty much you couldn't survive, they would vacation off planet for about 18 months and then come back to their to the Earth, so that they were rich enough to go back and forth. And I love the whole characterization. And eventually, Earth did die because it shook itself apart. I guess if a bad on a scale of 20, a seismic earthquake could shake the Earth apart. But basically, I don't know if that's how it happened. But he was a rich silver spoon kid, and it was his playground. They talked about the North American Preserve. So I thought it was all fascinating, that whole section, and it showed that this was a slow death. This was the end, and people kind of accepted it and moved on, except for these old families. And Silenus eventually went into cryogenic sleep, and that's where his story takes off. He writes his poetry, which is pretty amateurish as a kid, but he starts. He's a writer from the very beginning. But he goes into outer space, and John, I don't know if you have any emotional connection to the dying Earth and how it was represented, or if you want to talk about Heaven's Gate, where we go next in his life. 100 years later, he's asleep for 150 years later, I think.
I didn't have any real connection to the old Earth necessarily, except to note that, again, for anyone aspiring to write and do something as great as Dan Simmons has done here, he took his time explaining what happened to old Earth. It didn't necessarily move the plot of the story forward, but it invests the reader in, it gives closure on Earth. Why are we out in the stars? It closes that loop. I mean, he takes his time and just explains Silenus' character, explains the old Earth series, and that meant a lot to me, just because I felt like I'm really getting a complete story. So. And
then his new home, Heaven's Gate, is such the lap of luxury. He he didn't want for anything. He had the same lifestyle 150 years later, which is not true. Heaven's Gate is kind of a cruel a cruel interpretation of what the exact opposite of his new home. But 150
Slave
years
labor.
later, he was slave labor, and he landed there, and he has no assets. 150 years later, the bank has liquidated his family's debt. He had the stroke, so his vocabulary is
Brain
not.
damage.
Say
All he
again.
can do is cuss. All he can do is cuss and curse.
After his stroke, he thinks he's lucky
That's
because
funny.
he finds out that most people only have a 3-word vocabulary. His has the 9-word vocabulary with pee and poo and a couple of vulgar variations plus some other things. So I can only imagine how he communicates. And they actually have some really funny anecdotes in the book about him trying to talk to people. But this is a very serious part of the book because he could have easily been beaten down. He was used to an easy lifestyle, and he basically was an invalid, and he had to sit here and learn how to survive in this harsh atmosphere where he was essentially slave labor. He got paid, but he had to sit here and eke out a living on a planet where you could barely breathe. It was a huge slum world, this Heaven's Gate. And long story short is, again, how Dan Simmons, I think this is his love letter to writers. He talked about how you formulate words aren't what literature is about. It's the idea, and how to formulate that idea and translate it in a sense. Words just are a vehicle for this beautiful thing called literature. I might be butchering it a little bit, and Dan Simmons does 1,000 times better in actually writing this love letter to how, in this state, this invalid condition, Silenus was reborn. He says,
He was basically rebooted. I wanted to jump in there real quick about Dan Simmons' idea about words, because Silenus summed it up to the group of pilgrims when you flash forward, I guess, back to them. But he said words are the only thing that are unique to mankind. Words are the one thing the universe hasn't left behind for us, and it hasn't produced for us. Mankind, man, is the thing that produces. That's what we add to the universe. So that's how important words are. And I loved it. I just ate up that whole concept.
That's a beautiful articulation. Yeah, like I said, I butchered it, but that was exactly right. That was our legacy that we left behind. These ideas, these creations, that the universe, some biological, microscopic petri dish didn't do that. We did that. So you're right. And he eventually escapes Heaven's Gate, and it's funny because he starts to create his cantos, what he thinks is good poetry. He is reborn, and he takes his craft much more seriously. He's beaten up by the local bully who coerces protection money out of him, and I guess Silenus might say Pete Poop Brain. He might have said something to make the schoolyard bully mad. He gets beaten into an inch of his life. And this is kind of the storytelling mechanism to get him off Heaven's Gate. He's saved by this woman who reads his work in his backpack while he's healing up in the hospital, and this changes his life. Basically, his work gets to an interstellar publisher, and his work essentially is edited down to the elements of the dying Earth, because it is kind of his experience. Not of the dying Earth and how he experienced it firsthand. So it was the right time. It's kind of like one of those pieces of work. Again, Dan Simmons is talking about. He's talking to writers, John. He's like, there's only a few of these in a generation. These great magnum opuses that sit here and resonate with whole societies. And so this is his magnum opus for the pop culture. I don't want to confuse it with Silenus and what he wants to do in his writing career, and he becomes rich and famous. And this is a fun part of the book because it's just he's adapted to centuries later. He experiences Farcasters. His home is a huge Farcaster. Every room has a window, which is a Farcaster window that peeks into another world. So it's fun to sit here and have his writing room look over this huge mountain range. He's so bloody rich, and he can maintain all these 50,000 or 50 whatever credits a day, 50,000 credits a day, windows into all these worlds. And the funny one is his bathroom is a floating raft. It's like a porta potty, and it's in the middle of the ocean. And so he walks into a room and then he walks through to his bathroom. So it's really fun, this part of the book. He obviously does what rich people do. I won't say obviously, but people that are excessively rich and bored, he sits here and does flashback, which is the drug of the future, where you can actually reach into your memories and experience the exact memory you want. So he dabbles in a lot of things. And then what happens to him with his publisher, John? Does he take Dying Earth, and then is he able to go off on it and write whatever he wants because he's so famous now?
Well, kind of, until they flick him in the eyeball. So he comes back. He wants to write a second work, and it wasn't Dying Earth 2. He had a totally different Cantos, isn't that right? It was something different. He had written something new, and he took it to the publisher, and it put her to tears. She said, "This is beautiful," and she said, "It's not going to sell at all." And
I love the publisher.
Yeah, I was cracking up at that point. But she explained to him that the reason his first work was so good was because everybody was ready for it at that point in time. It was the right thing at the right time. And he said, "Well, I've got all this credit as a writer. Will you publish it anyway?" And she said, "Yes, I will." But one thing she said to him that really made me laugh hard was she was explaining some other works that were written at the right place at the right time for the right people, right?
Yeah.
And one of them was Mein Kampf by Hitler.
Right.
So Linus doesn't know who Hitler is, and so she goes, "Oh, he was just some older politician who did some writing."
You're right. That was funny.
Me up.
I mean, it's a cautionary tale of, if what's that cliche? If you forget your history, you're doomed to repeat it. Right. That was pretty hilarious. The publisher, like, we're going to meet Sad King Billy in this part of the book, and like Sad King Billy, the publisher is a great character. She has great cameos, and so I love how Dan Simmons, deftly done, the way he has a huge ensemble cast, but he still manages to have these characters with cameos just come to life. They breathe life, and they are so vivid, and they're hilarious. The other thing about her is how when they did publish this second work, and I don't know why I'm having it flopped, and he said, "Why didn't you do the big run, press run like you were planning?" He's like, "Oh, well, we put it in front of an AI, artificial intelligence, and the robot loved it too, so we knew everybody would hate it." So, and I was just laughing. Again, technology. They're using algorithms in the future, and yeah, the robots loved it, so we knew people would hate it.
But I really had to appreciate the fact that the publishing industry was still alive and well 700 years later, and they basically turned him into a serialized crap novelist. And he hated his own characters, because once he got to the 10th book in this series, he looked at her and said, "Can I kill this guy off now?"
Oh, John, man, see, this is just fun, because it's like we have this whole part of his life, and it gets even better than this. I keep talking about how Dan Simmons keeps on upping the game, so I hope I'm not in store for a fast flame out, because we're having so much fun with this part of the book. But it's kind of paradoxical. It's like he loses his soul. He's such a hack writer now, and it's called Dying Earth 5, 6, 7. It's kind of like a joke. It's like the Rocky series. It just keeps going, and he wants to kill his characters off. So he knows he's a sellout. Has he essentially become a pop culture writer, and he's just making money just to survive? And so it's really interesting. It's kind of like he makes a decision. She threatens to sit here and take all his assets from him, including this incredible house. And his wife eventually does leave him, because he's married. He has everything he could want, right? We look at the other side of the lawn. He has everything he could want, but he at one point, this is what changes his mind about, what am I willing to sell my soul for? He loses his muse, and again, what's a muse? And we get a kind of an introduction on this is a real thing. He wakes up in his house one day, and I think he's not talking. He's having a thought processor and a computer say everything, and it prints it out. And I think the printout said, "Where has my muse gone?" Or "My muse is left." And it's a printout on a computer, which is a small irony. He's just using all this technology, but the thing he needs is gone, and that's what changes his mind. He kind of makes a big life decision here.
Yeah, yeah. He goes ahead and he sells. Well, not all of his assets, but a majority of them. The house. He goes back to the publisher and he says, "Okay, I'm not writing any more books." And she threatens him with, "Well, we're going to destroy you. You're done. You owe us millions of marks." He said, "Nope, I sold my stuff. I'm paying you right now." And he left. And that's where we transition to where he falls in with Mad King Billy, or just King Billy at the time.
It's sad. It's old sad King Billy.
Sad King Billy, that's right. And this is where, and again, another reason why the Silenus tale was one of my favorites so far, is we move into a story that parallels, and they say it right out in the book, but it parallels Beowulf in a lot of ways, and including the tragedy. When King Billy, who is taking in these artists and writers, and he appreciates all of the things that they do, the good works, and he read Silenus' work that was published that flopped before he became a serialized writer, and Billy said, "I loved it. Will you write more?" And he provided him a home and a living to write. And then of course we move into Hyperion here, because King Billy learns about Hyperion, and he wants to establish some colonies on Hyperion, and he was going to have a poet city.
This is what makes the book so good right here, because we are seeing the living history of Hyperion. It's like a living witness, to say from the Civil War, if you want to think of it like that. You have someone who was actually there. So my eyeballs are bulging out of my head, because we see, in the beginning of the book, we see Hyperion centuries later. The heart of the planet is Keats. It's this busy spaceport. They've been given official colonial status. They're almost near a booming metropolitan type society on these continents. So we come back to the beginning. You find out that you have this sad King Billy, who's a lover of the arts, and he creates a whole society dedicated to it. I have to sit here and say I love how we have 150 colonies. You could have a colony for each religion, each type of hobby. It's like a whole society of like-minded people, and he has a society of these artists. So you can kind of imagine in your head, what direction would that kind of society take? And we do see that on Hyperion. He's kind of forced to go there early, but he's always had the plan to go there. And the City of Poets, John, is on the northern part of Hyperion. And in the future, we see that it's a deserted desert city next to the time tombs. And so I'm sitting here chomping at the bit thinking, oh my goodness, Silenus survived the fall of the City of Poets. Or he was there when it was built. I'm jumping ahead. I didn't necessarily know what was going to happen, but he saw the rise of this great city, this vision of this man who was obscenely rich that could do it. And there had been a first colony, but they had kind of gone native, and now they used androids and the indigenous population to build this city, and it was absolutely awesome. And I love this part of the book. And Sad King Billy is another one of the characters that just comes to life. We find out that Dan Simmons has to flesh him out, because he becomes very important, but he's just so fun, his characterization, and he's one of my favorite characters.
And we need to point out really quickly, and I'm sorry I jumped in there, the city Keats was named after John Keats, who was one of Sad King Billy's favorite poets, and this is going to be very important later on in the book, very important. But the name of that city, Keats, the fact that John Keats was Billy's favorite, listeners need to remember that for later on.
Uh-oh, I forgot why that's so important, but maybe you can remind me when we get there. But so my favorite part of the book thus far is here, living with these people in the City of Poets, which it's called, and they have a happy-go-lucky lifestyle. If you can imagine visual artists, and everybody kind of having, their perfect life that you could imagine. They get here and get to practice their craft. But then, unfortunately, people start dying. So this is about 200 years ago from the current day of the pilgrimage of our cast of 7 that are going to, on Hyperion right now. So 200 years ago, people started dying, and you know what? So it's Beowulf and it's the Grendel. They have everything in the Grendel story except for their own hero, Beowulf. So that was again informative for me, thinking, why would these people stay here? So I love the analogy. They became victims. they didn't have a hero. And in the story of Beowulf, what are they going to do? This is their home. They can't necessarily flee. So these people may have had the means to flee, but maybe they were just trapped in some other respect, and they started dying grisly deaths. And this is where it gets interesting for the character of Silenus, because we find out that his muse that fled him, and which made him decide he wanted to be a real writer, and he went to his kindred spirits. His muse finally returned, but his muse only returned when the killings started. So it's kind of a very creepy, a creepy part of the book, because he can only write when people die, and we kind of see all this play out when Sad King Billy approaches him, when the killings get really bad, and they have a great scene that makes Silenus very nervous, because Sad King Billy is willing to go into action, and he's actually willing to interrogate and connect Silenus to these mind probes and basically just open up his scalp. Sounds very gruesome how they interrogate people, and it makes Silenus nervous. But Sad King Billy is, he's basically saying, listen, I know you've been writing, and it's only when killings happen. It's dated the same days, when the killings happen. Are you connected? So we quickly, figure out Billy's trying to see if he's connected. We know he's not, but it's still kind of a insight into the Silenus character.
And here's where you start bringing a lot more together, too. There are more connections to Keats in the story, but the big connection here is that supposedly, and I didn't research this, and I should have, I just didn't have time this week, supposedly Keats started on a work called Hyperion, and this is supposed to be real, and it was unfinished, but the idea was that maybe he'd had some visions about something, so there's a connection there with Keats and Hyperion and the fact that he's a poet. Now you've got Silenus, he's also a poet. He's on Hyperion for real, okay? And the Shrike is his muse. The Shrike's killings are inspiring him, and Mad King Billy comes to him, and he says to him, your writings are calling the Shrike. And I started to make a few leaps here, and I just wanted to talk about them real quick. I know we don't have a whole lot of time left on this section, but the leaps I made here were that maybe writing mattered to the Shrike, and that's not really the right way to say it. Not writing, but the fact that things were being written about the Shrike's killings, glorifying the Shrike, and the Shrike's a very complicated character. But when Mad King Billy approaches Silenus and at one point takes his works and tries to burn his cantos because he firmly believes that Silenus' writings are calling the Shrike to kill more, the Shrike appears, and I'll let you take it from here.
You know what? I thought that was an erroneous connection. I didn't think there was a connection because it was kind of a paradoxical dilemma. It's like he couldn't have written what he wrote without his muse, the Shrike. But the Shrike can't come if the writings aren't there. It's not like the writings are conjuring him. So it's kind of a paradox. But you know what? Sad King Billy does make a move to basically abandon the city. They go to Keats, and this becomes a city of a city of the dead, but becomes a city with a few hundred, 200 people, and I don't know what kind of fatalists they were, but it goes back to the Grendel mentality of maybe they were fatalists because they could leave, but they also felt like they had to stay there. Silenus knew he had to stay here. That was his muse. And over the next decade, this all happens over 10 years, which I found insane. But basically, the Shrike pilgrimages, which had been they had been stopped for a while, they talked about those have been resumed. So I could kind of buy into this that, okay, fine, maybe the Shrike had other people to kill, and Silenus wasn't on his radar because the pilgrims, which started going to the time tombs. But I love this part as well because it's a city of the dead, and the 200 people that remain, eventually over 10 years, they all die except Silenus. He's the sole survivor. So you're right, John. Maybe there is a connection. The Shrike obviously fixated on Silenus. He knew what he was doing. There are other clues to say he knew what he was doing, like visiting him in the night, and it was crazy because Silenus becomes this little old hermit and a crazy little hermit. But Sad King Billy eventually, after 12 years or 10 years, does come back. He sneaks in. There's not many ways to get back to the north, and he basically confronts Silenus, and Silenus is enraged because Sad King Billy read his cantos, his life's work, and Sad King Billy zaps him, and he says, "This will stop." And when he awakes, he's in the town square. It's a great scene. Sad King Billy is basically burning his cantos, and Silenus is painfully, and he can barely control his motor function skills. He's inching towards him, begging him to stop, watching himself essentially burn. It's kind of a metaphor, I think. And then he talks about, in his mind's eye, nothing came so much as just appeared right before him. We know the Shrike will come, and the Shrike does come. And Silenus doesn't know when he says, who he's rooting for, basically. In his own mind, he doesn't want Billy to die, his friend of 20 years. The Shrike grabs him, and he basically elevates him, and he's piercing him. He's killing him right there. And Silenus has to make a decision. He does want to say he's not completely out of it. He doesn't sit here and say, "Oh, good, my work is safe." No, he still has his humanity, and it's a great scene because he takes 5 big bounds. He can actually walk now, and he throws a bucket of kerosene onto the Shrike and to Sad King Billy, who's holding a burning part of his cantos, and they go up in flames, and the Shrike makes this piercing scream, and it's an insane scene because you think, uh-oh, Silenus is dead. Okay, he was maybe the Shrike's favorite, or maybe there was some connection, but now he pretty much attacked him. But no, I think the Shrike, for me, I made a connection that 200 years ago, when he got burned, maybe he got burned badly enough, and he had to go heal or recuperate somewhere. So Sad King Billy dies, and then the Shrike disappears, and Silenus, he still needs to recover. He writes his cantos again. He spends another 5 years trying to rewrite what was burned. He becomes the crazy old, what I think is like a Gollum character, this little mad hermit that's written into the history records, some crazy guy living in the city. He yells at the time tunes at night, daring the Shrike to come back, calling him a coward. And I'm just like, holy cow, this guy did go insane. And that's essentially, his story. He decides to go back into cryosleep for another 200 years, which is how we meet him in this day and age. And I was absolutely floored by this story. Even I don't have sympathy for him, but he's going back to Hyperion to finish his life's work. And I'm like,
and that's where I kept making the connection between the writing and the Shrike, is that work is unfinished. And the Shrike did not kill him, and I am pretty convinced, because of the fact the Shrike appeared when Sad King Billy, who could have been killed at any point as well, started burning the works. I think that mattered to the Shrike, because in this particular story, the Shrike is shown as an animal. He's a monster. In the other stories, he's shown as a war machine, or he's shown as some kind of religious thing to be worshipped. In this one, he's shown as that Grendel. And way back when, in the story of Beowulf, what was it about? It was about your name being remembered, your story going out, glorifying your actions and deeds, and Silenus was doing that in the ultimate cantos. And the work is not finished. And somehow I just kept thinking that there was a connection between the writing and the Shrike, and I think it was just the glorification of the Shrike's killings, because that's all it does.
I'm glad your background is in English, John, because that's incredible insight into, like you said, how this Shrike is perceived, or how he comes to people and they see him differently. So it is almost like a deity as far as like how people view him and how he chooses to present himself. And in this one, he wants his deeds glorified. That's absolutely fascinating. I wouldn't have made that connection. And after all these bombshells are dropped, John, I didn't think the book could get any better. So for me, I was like, wow. This was a pulse-pounding part of the book, and I didn't have high expectations for our next character. I'll sit here and shamefully say this, but Sol Weintraub is the professor, and he's the next story, and they're waiting. And I love it. Coming back to their pilgrimage, they're waiting on this giant wind wagon, and the wind wagon eventually comes because it's their only transport across thousands of miles of this sea of grass, which is 6, 7 feet, 10 feet tall, with grass snakes in it. But anyway, we get on the boat, and this is where he tells his tale. Sol Weintraub has a daughter who's only weeks old with him. Why would he bring a daughter here. So you're thinking, this guy's a nutcase, and he's a professor. So in this part of the story, it's about, it comes back, it circles back around to faith, and it circles back around to a very normal life, completely different from Silenus. They live on one of the oldest colonies. Sol Weintraub, his daughter Rachel, we find out he has an older daughter, and then his wife, who's a music critic. He's a professor. It's an ideal little life on a rustic planet, and the daughter grows up. He's the proud father. She follows in his footsteps of being an academic, and then gets her advanced degree in archaeology, and then she wants to go blaze her own trail. And we find this is where things kind of go downhill, and this is where the story actually intersects with Hyperion. She becomes an archaeologist, and where does she go first? She goes to one of the biggest mysteries in the universe, which is the time tombs. And so the time tubes and their design allows, it doesn't make sense. So it's this enigma, and they want to map out the whole time tombs. And what happens to Rachel, and the connection that we find out, is that Rachel, in the middle of the night, in like the very bowels of the Sphinx, this is like a horror part of the story. All the lights go out, and she has an encounter with the Shrike, and it's not anything graphic because she essentially faints, but she's in this completely claustrophobic and insanely scary situation where she's maybe gets trapped in these time waves that are approaching, that her instruments read before they go dead, and she's trapped.
The time tides.
The time tides.
Anti-entropic fields, yeah. I think
anti-entropic fields is Star Trek talk. We can't we can't confuse people with that. No, very good though. I wasn't even going to attempt to call them what they really were. And bottom line is, she at the same time she's in this accident, Sol Weintraub has this dream, and this is where the theology comes in. He's a non-believing Jew, but he has a dream about the story of Abraham in the Bible, about how Abraham is commanded by God to sacrifice his son Isaac. It's a human sacrifice, and basically Abraham wrestles with it and essentially says, okay, I will. So it's a test of obedience. God doesn't make him sacrifice his son. It's just seeing if he will, as if he loves God more than he loves his son. So in this dream, it mirrors that, but we basically know it's the Shrike because it has these evil eyes in the dream, and Saul brushes it off. But it's important to note that he has the dream at this point when Rachel has her accident, and then what happens next, John? What do we see? What changes their life forever?
Well, I'm going to make two comments before I jump into that. First of all, there's no accident that Dan Simmons decided to make the character of Weintraub Jewish, okay? Because of that direct parallel of the Abraham story. And clearly Weintraub, for his entire tale, battles with the concept of that blind obedience, even where you might kill one of your children. And also, Weintraub is the first character we've come to in the book so far who has not personally been to Hyperion. He's the first member of the group. Now, he's got a connection because of his daughter, but he hasn't personally been there. But what happens next is we find out that they get a call that their daughter's been in a terrible accident. They go to see her on another world. And because she was caught in the time tides, where there was a huge surge of energy that she was caught in inside that Sphinx structure near the time tombs, where the book describes that she actually was touched by the Shrike at some point in those tombs. Things started shifting around, and the Shrike appeared, grabbed her, and then the next thing she knows, she's in a hospital. She is not physically injured, but she is aging backwards. She's becoming younger, and she is going to die, really a very slow death, as she ages back into a tiny infant, and then basically, cells combining, and then that's it. So
poof, out of existence,
yep.
Just like that. You know what? This concept, Dan Simmons definitely done a great job on keeping continuity here, because you have to account for so many things when you're aging backwards. How does that affect people around you? Because basically she was aging at a normal rate, one day at a time like she normally would, but every day that she lived, it was a day younger. She was losing that day's experience. So it's like if I met you tomorrow, and then we would keep going in the future, I would forget once we got to the tomorrow, which was my yesterday, if you can follow this logic here, I would forget you because that's the day we met, and then the next day, that's a day earlier in my life, but you would still know me. So this presented a unique challenge where important people in her life, her boyfriend, her friends who became middle-aged, this chapter actually takes us, John, through her whole life backwards, and her parents sit here and get youth treatments, I guess, and they change their wardrobe style to earlier styles. So as she gets younger, if she remembers when she's 16, she remembers a certain style of clothes, then they have to actually replicate that because they make a conscious decision to normalize her life. But every day she has to get reoriented. She will forget that day. Readers might be totally confused. I might not be. You have to actually read the book to understand how well Dan Simmons throws you into this reverse time loop of life, and it brings so much emotional impact. It's so incredibly heartbreaking, and I won't be ashamed to say that I cried once in this part of the book, and I had to stop reading at another part, and I'll tell you what those are later. But basically, the girl sits here and has to listen to, here's the life I had, but not really, because I can't remember any of it. Heartbreaking scenes with her boyfriend, who spends years trying to get another research funding set up to go figure out the mystery of the time tubes, to try to fix this, to save her. And he meets her again when she's 12 years old. He can barely stand to see her. He's so traumatized because he's failed her. And her dad and her mom, they have lots of thoughts. We come to find out even suicidal thoughts, because you have to sit here and comfort your child. It's kind of depressing in a lot of regards and melancholy, but it's so true to life how it would actually be represented. A family having to watch their child lose her skills. She eventually starts losing her skills, and I could keep going on and on. And my point is this book was so, this part of the book was so incredible. I'm like, how do we keep getting better and better? It's so completely different from everything that's come before, but it resonates on such a human level. And I'll let you tell me your thoughts and your favorites in this section, John. But the one thing that hit me hard was a really emotional, intimate scene where they're on a couch, and I believe the daughter eventually, I don't know how old she is at this age, but she says, "Dad, I want you to stop telling me. Don't tell me every day that I had this life, that an accident happened. I don't want to know. I want to make the most of what I have now." And it's kind of gut-wrenching for the dad, because she's making this conscious decision, and it's again, she'll forget that decision the next day because she'll be living a day early in her life. So it's gut-wrenching to see how they have to relive the whole life a day at a time with her losing her skills and who she is. It's got to be. I couldn't be in their shoes, to be honest with you.
No, I'm right there with you. As a dad with a daughter, actually, that would just kill me. To me, the best way to describe it is she can only, and this is you're gonna go, duh, yeah. She can only remember things from the day before. So as she loses a day on her age, she can only remember something from the day before. She can't remember what's coming. Like if you told her, hey, tomorrow we're doing this, well, she might remember that day, but the next day you never told her that, right?
Yeah. Right.
So, but to me, this whole thing with her aging backwards added a new dimension to just how evil that Shrike is. And frankly, we don't even know much about the Shrike still. We know what it can do, but I don't know much about what makes it tick. But this is a mental way of inflicting extreme pain on humans. And again, we know he's the Lord of Pain. This is how he communicates, through pain and death. And this is the most twisted way to inflict pain. The other ways we've seen him hack people in half and tear heads off and just have a bloodbath, but this is mental anguish he's inflicted on these people. We learned early on in the book too, I think something that needs to be noted, the Sphinx that she was in near the time tombs, what they called the Sphinx, they said that thing was 500,000 years old, and it was built by somebody. And it looked like something a humanoid type of entity would build. So there's that mystery still up in the air. And then I wanted to note something real quick. Throughout this book, Dan Simmons continues to provide these beautiful descriptions of things. And one that stuck with me was that Weintraub looked up at one point and saw a storm rolling in, and he said it was a bruised curtain rolling across the sky that was lighted from within. And that's a pretty simple description, but it's so accurate. I can picture it perfectly in my head. And Simmons just has these descriptions over and over. They're all different. They're all unique. He's not reusing the same verbiage or the same words over and over. And just wanted to compliment his writing real quick.
You're right.
Moving ahead.
Basically his realization of the world is a fully realized world. It's incredible, and basically the motif of time here is pretty insidious. How the mental anguish, and you're right, how she's cursed and blessed, as a Shrike bishop was told Saul Weintraub later on, because he's at his wit's end. Saul basically keeps having these dreams. He finds out later his wife is having these dreams about, take. We didn't actually. I didn't actually tell you. The Shrike is telling Saul to take his child to Hyperion, to a place of his choice, for sacrifice. I think. Did he say she's going to be sacrificed, or just take her?
Right. No. Yeah. He said take your only child to the world called Hyperion, to a place where you'll be told, and offer her as a burnt offering.
Okay, so he did. So basically, yeah, it matches one for one the biblical story, insofar as that's concerned. But basically, we have this motif of time, and we have Saul wrestling throughout his life for years and years. He has to wrestle with how to handle his daughter. The part where I cried at was, I think his wife, I'm not sure if his wife died at this point, but it was a 4-year-old Rachel. He found her. Yeah, the wife went off planet, and they actually had to leave their home because of the tourists and the reporters. Dan Simmons has no love for reporters, because he just butchers them, as them destroying this family's life. So they're on another planet, quiet and calm. It's a Jewish planet. But anyway, Rachel's in a closet looking at pictures of her own life, her archaeology expeditions, and she looks up at her dad really innocently. She's 4 years old, and she says, "Dad, you never told me I had an older sister." And for whatever reason, that broke me, because I started bawling right there. And he eventually has to make a decision. He goes to see the Shrike bishop, and the Shrike bishop freaks out, because before the reporters actually create a spectacle of their life, it's all secret. And the Shrike bishop is, in our day and age, he looked like this evil satanic, red floating, thing that worships, the Shrike, aka Satan. But basically, the bishop freaks out when Saul says, "Your daughter's cursed." He find out what happened to her, so he ends the meeting there. He said, "She is cursed and blessed. She's, we cannot do nothing for you." She's basically, it's representative of what will happen to mankind. So you get a little bit of theology, or get a little bit of what these lunatics think, the ones who worship the Shrike. And then after that, I know you might have some thoughts on that part, but at the very end, when Saul's by himself, he has to get back to that planet. And I love how he uses the news media to his advantage. He gets on a talk show, and he says, "Hey, the government, the Church of the Shrike are not helping me. My daughter will just cease to exist," as you said earlier. And that gambit plays off. He gets public sympathy, and in the court of public opinion, that helps him get back on the pilgrimage. He gets on the roster. You mentioned a long time ago how these people get on the roster, and we find out how Saul Weintraub actually does make his way back. So that's his story. We could go really deep into all these things that happened to his daughter, and I'll tell you, one of my favorites was her 22nd or 20th birthday, and they invited her middle-aged friends. The parents forgot, oh, her friends are going to look a lot older. Oh, and they have kids. They didn't. I don't know if they consciously forgot, but basically, it was one of those funny parts where she freaks out, like, holy crap, my friends are like 10 years older than me. So this whole chapter is a good read, because it shows that life in reverse. But anything else you have on this, John?
I did. I had 3 more points I have to make real quick. In just another parallel to the Bible, in the Bible, and again, this is referring to people that have been told or ordered to do something by God, right? And I said earlier that Weintraub was battling with this concept of just blind obedience. He did not want to sacrifice his daughter. In fact, in his dreams, he would shout back at the Shrike or whatever was talking to him and say, "I'm not sacrificing my daughter." But in the Bible, with a lot of the characters in the Bible, when they disobeyed or ignored God's commandment, a lot of times punishment followed immediately afterwards. And again, it's another direct parallel to what's going on with Weintraub. He's being punished, this mental anguish, and his daughter was punished, his wife was punished, she's dead. They've had to go through so much. But this type of punishment is kind of fitting for a scholar. Mental punishment would be fitting for a scholar. That would be the worst kind of punishment you could give that guy. Just like the way that Father Duray died, crucified, dying over and over, coming back to life and dying again. Kind of a fitting punishment for someone of religion. The only person I haven't really seen, seeing Sad King Billy die a death by a Grendel pretty much, and having to see that as kind of a fitting punishment for someone who appreciates poems and stories, right? The only person I haven't seen punished yet is Cassad. The Shrike used Cassad, and Cassad is alive and well. He's on a vendetta to kill the Shrike, if I can throw us back to last podcast. He's the only one that hasn't really been punished in any way. In fact, Cassad kind of enjoyed that bloodbath. He has a bloodlust, as the book discussed. But the last point I need to make is that we know from the very beginning of this story, one of these characters is still probably an Ouster spy.
Dun, 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 dun.
And it's possible that one of these stories may not even be true, because they're lying to fit in with the group. So I don't know what's coming, but I'm pretty excited to see what happens in the last part of the book.
I think Cassad was punished, John, because he had a lifelong lover. He was able to have this relationship, quote unquote, with her, and he found out it was a complete lie. So it was the love of his life. So, man,
gotcha.
You went pretty deep down the rabbit hole about the punishments of these characters and how the Shrike made it suited to them. That's pretty deep, and you're right. And maybe the Church of the Shrike is some nefarious, organization to basically rout Christianity. It's not like this global holy war, but there's so many themes of religion. You can't deny it, or it's part of the book. It's this interstellar mystery set on this grand scale, which is fascinating, and it's very unique. But it has these ties to faith and religion and acceptance and maybe going through trials. So I enjoy it. It's not beating you over the head, but I really enjoy it. And as a Christian, I'm really wondering what will be the end result. What is this all building up to? Because they've threaded the whole story together beautifully, but hopefully the payoff will sit here and answer a lot of mysteries and see the Shrike get shanked, in my opinion, I hope. But John, this has been episode 8 on the Reign of Books podcast. I've enjoyed it immensely. We have a few more characters to go. Next week is the finale to Hyperion, and we will find out if the Shrike can be conquered and if any of the 7 in our group can do it, with or without a rebel or ouster spy. John, it's been great. Thanks for coming on the Reign of Books podcast. You can check us out on the Goodreads group, and you can follow that through our website. That's reignofbooks.com. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you guys next week.
All right, read on.